As I'm sure many of you know, Donkey Kong is finally getting a brand new game on the Nintendo Switch 2, that being Donkey Kong Bananza, so I thought it might be fun to replay the previous DK game, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. The thing is though, after watching the trailer for Bananza and seeing how much destruction DK likes to cause, I thought to myself, wouldn't it be nice for him to do something a little less violent? So for today's video, we're gonna play through Tropical Freeze, but with a twist. Can you beat Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze without touching a single enemy? The rules are simple. We have to play through Tropical Freeze while touching the least amount of enemies as possible. The only exception to this rule are the bosses, since they're required to move on. We're also gonna try to avoid using any items from Funky Kong's item shop, but we're allowed to use them if it means the challenge can continue. So without further ado, let's go! The game opens with everyone celebrating DK's birthday, when all of a sudden, a pirate ship appears, blows the Kongs away, and turns the island into a frozen wasteland. We then cut to Donkey Kong crashing onto a different island, and with that, our adventure begins. 1-1 is a very easy level. There are a couple birds and grasshoppers in the beginning, plus a few penguins near the end, but you always have enough room to jump over them or slide underneath them. 1-2 has you climbing up walls, and you have to be careful to avoid these bugs flying around, but this level is, again, pretty easy. This is also the stage to introduce Dixie Kong. Dixie Kong is by far the best side character in this game, and she will absolutely be the main character you want to use for this challenge. 1-3 is normally the level where you'd use Cranky Kong, but for right now, I'm gonna stick with Dixie. Sorry buddy, maybe next time. Once again, be careful not to touch the flying bugs, as well as these slugs near the end, and you'll be all good. 1-4 is our very first minecart level. I was a bit worried about this one because these levels are much faster paced than the others, but it ended up not being too bad. The only part to be careful of is right here. I was rolling along when suddenly a piece of junk fell into the track and I got launched right on top of an enemy. You can avoid this by jumping right before this happens, but it did take me a couple tries. But when all that's done, we can move on to our first boss battle, and this will be our first real challenge of the game. Normally, this boss is a total breeze, but now that we have an extra restriction of not touching enemies, it becomes a lot harder. Like I said, we're allowed to touch the boss himself, but this guy will bring in smaller enemies that we can't touch. The main attack that makes this boss such a huge pain is this one. He'll throw fish onto the stage that will flop around for a bit. I found the best strategy was to carefully run underneath the fish, but since there are 3 of them and we don't have that much room to work with, this is easier said than done. It definitely took me a few tries to get this down, but eventually I managed to pull it off. So after hitting the boss enough times, you can aggressively beat that seal into the unknown, and just like that, we completed World 1, and we did so while touching 0 enemies. So far, so good. We can now move on to World 2. 2-1 isn't too bad. There are a couple scary parts where you need to jump on some tiny platforms with enemies nearby, but it's not that hard. 2-2 is where we first get introduced to Rambi the Rhino. Now, it'd probably be a lot easier to beat the level without a ginormous rhino, but I thought, what the hell, and decided to see if it was still possible to beat the level while riding Rambi, and surprisingly, it was. Sure, you have to make a few tight jumps here and there to avoid accidentally hitting enemies, but if you're careful, you can pull through. 2-3 is a very easy level with all the enemies being easily avoidable. 2-4 is another minecart level, and for the most part, it's very easy with no enemies to worry about. But then you get to this part where you go outside, and you'll notice a bunch of these thick owls floating nearby. It is possible to avoid them all, but with how fast you're going, you need to be wary so one doesn't sneak up on you. In fact, I had this one moment where I thought I was gonna hit an owl, but I ended up in one of the bonus rooms, so that was lucky. 2-5 has you bouncing on a ton of hot air balloons. The only part worth noting is this one, as you have to bounce on balloons while also avoiding flying penguins. It is a bit stressful, but it's still possible. 2-6 has you sliding down several vines while avoiding some birds that are on fire. There's also a few on-foot sections with some enemies to avoid, but they're not that difficult. And with that, it's time to move on to our second boss battle. This one is against this giant owl king. He'll shoot feathers at you, throw these giant ice balls, lay eggs containing enemies, and Oh, this is not good. So yeah, in order to defeat this boss, you're supposed to jump on these enemies and throw them at the boss to hurt it. That is exactly what we don't want to do, but unfortunately, I don't see any way around it. We can't jump on his head because it has spikes on it. I even busted out my boy Cranky Kong, who can bounce on spikes, but still no dice. So I was out of options. I had to touch an enemy in order to move on. In fact, I had to use 3 enemies just to get past the first phase. The second phase wasn't much better. I had to use another 3 enemies for this one too, and on top of that, I had to make sure the enemy I picked up didn't collide with other enemies, so that was fun. But then after that, you can move on to the third phase. You'd probably think I would need to touch another 3 enemies to beat the boss, right? Well, surprisingly no, because during the third phase, there is an attack where you can directly hit the boss without needing to use enemies. If only there were attacks like this in the previous phases. But once you jump on his head 3 times, you punch him for a few seconds, and just like that, the fight is over. This level ended up costing us 6 enemies to complete. Yikes. So here's hoping the rest of the game will be a bit more forgiving. Alright, let's move on to World 3. 3-1 is a super fun level with dancing trees and animals all over the place, and dodging all of the enemies is really easy, so no need to worry. 3-2 was also really easy with nothing of note to say. 3-3 has a huge tornado with all sorts of junk flying around and lightning trying to strike you. This is another level where you're supposed to use Rambi the Rhino, but I decided not to just to be safe. The main thing I'll say is just to be careful about enemies flying around in the wind and you'll be all good. 3-4 has you running through a forest that's been engulfed in flames. Make sure to avoid these little hedgehogs that catch on fire and you won't have much trouble. 3-5 is our very first rocket barrel level. We have to ride this rocket all the way to the end of the stage, and all of the enemies that show up are very easy to dodge, so no worries. 3-6 mostly has you blasting from cannons to get to the end. There's only one part here where you have to avoid enemies on foot, and once again, it's not a big deal. And just like that, we've made our way to the boss battle, this one being against a trio of monkeys. And lucky for us, this boss doesn't have any additional enemies that show up during the fight, so you can play it just like normal. And with these guys defeated, we completed World 3. Wow, this world was actually pretty easy. We're still only sitting at 6 enemies touched from the previous world. Let's try and keep it that way. We're now on to World 4, aka the one with all the water levels. Lovely. 4-1 isn't too bad for the most part. With the majority of enemies, you're able to just swim around. There is this one very large fish that might seem impossible to dodge at first, but you can just barely sneak underneath him, so that's a relief. But then you reach this part. You see these 2 fish right here? Yeah, we have to get past them to reach the end of the stage, but as you can see, there is simply not enough room to squeeze over or under them. I tried over and over again, but to no avail, and there aren't any secret exits until later in the level, so I had no choice. I had to defeat one of the fish in order to get past. This world is not off to a good start, but once you get past that little hiccup, the rest of the level is possible. Just be careful of this one part where you quickly swim by a bunch of urchins and you'll be okay. 4-2 is another minecart level with not that many enemies to avoid aside from a couple sharks. 4-3 is an underwater level that takes place in the dark. The only enemies to keep an eye on are these jellyfish that move very quickly up and down, but once you figure out the pattern, it's smooth sailing, or I guess swimming in this case. 4-4 is another underwater level, who would have guessed? Make sure to carefully avoid all the fish and mines floating around, and you'll eventually reach this part where you've got to be kidding me. Yep, we have another path that is blocked by a row of fish, and just like before, there isn't nearly enough room for us to get around them, so sadly, it looks like we're once again gonna have to take out an enemy to move forward. Or do we? If you don't recall, I mentioned a secret exit in 4-1. This leads to a new path with separate levels, which may give us a chance to avoid touching that enemy. We still have to touch that one fish to get to the secret exit, which stinks, but once that's done, we can move on to 4-A. This level takes place during a massive thunderstorm with tons of enemies. You have to make a lot of tight movements to avoid penguins, owls, and fish, but with enough practice, it is possible. You'll want to make sure you have Cranky Kong for this level, as you need him to reach another secret exit to move on to another secret level. 4-B requires you to swim through several passageways to collect keys and open chests in order to move forward. I really don't like this level. It's not hard by any means and you can avoid the enemies with little to no problems, but this level is just boring and a slog to get through. But once this stage is done, we have a direct path to 4-5, meaning we've skipped over that one part in 4-4 where we had to touch another enemy. Nice. 4-5 is up, and immediately we run into a problem. You see this little guy in the background throwing bombs at us? We're meant to throw the bomb at that stack of crates over there in order to move forward, but there just so happens to be another penguin walking around nearby, and this bomb causes a huge explosion that will most definitely hit the penguin. For a second, I thought I was screwed, but then I had an idea. If I could get the bomb to explode mid-air at the very top of the crates, I could maybe destroy them without harming the penguin. So I put my plan to the test and hey, it worked! The rest of the level isn't too bad. I had another moment where I had to use the same strategy to get past another wall of crates. There's also this part where you have to get past this extra thick bunny, but with a well-timed roll, you can get past him, and just like that, this level is done. 4-6 contains a couple parts where there's a bunch of purple urchins floating from below. This might seem scary at first, but it's not too bad, and the rest of the level is a cakewalk. And now, it's time for the fourth boss battle. This one is against a pufferfish that grows really big, and you have to wait to ram into his butt to cause damage. This guy will also fire some smaller enemies out to attack you, and you have to make sure not to touch the walls as those contain enemies all around it. This boss definitely took me quite a few tries, as the movement of the smaller fish can be unpredictable at times. And during the third phase, some of the enemies clinging to the walls become unstuck, so you have to keep an eye on them too. But with enough perseverance and patience, you can avoid all of them, and with this boss now beaten senselessly, World 4 is done. We ended up having to touch one extra enemy to get through here, which brings our current count to 7. Not as bad as World 2, but hopefully we can keep that number there for the rest of the challenge. Next up is my favorite world of the game, World 5. 5-1 is pretty easy. There are a couple tight jumps you have to make here and there, but nothing you can't handle. 5-2 is another rocket barrel level where you have to fly through the giant fruit factory. Most of the level is pretty easy, however there is this one tricky part where you have to carefully squeeze in between two enemies. This one took me a few tries, but it is possible. 5-3 has you jumping on all sorts of fruit and avoiding giant blades of death. The only enemies I'd keep an eye on are these plants here. If you get within their line of sight, they'll shoot their extra long tongue at you, so as long as you're careful around them, you should be good. 5-4 is another very easy level, but you must be very careful in a couple places. There are these platforms throughout the stage that you have to ground pound in order to keep going, but 2 of these platforms have penguins walking on them, so be absolutely sure they walk off the platform before ground pounding it, otherwise you will kill them. 5-5 is a very fun level where you get to bounce off jello cubes. There are a few penguins bouncing around too, as well as some owls flying nearby, but with some patience you can beat the level with no problems. 5-6 has everything frozen over, and you know what that means? We have to deal with ice physics. Great. But even with that, the level isn't that hard. There are a couple tricky maneuvers you have to do in order to get past a few enemies, but nothing that will get in our way. We then have another boss battle against this polar bear, and thankfully there aren't any other enemies that spawn in, so we can fight the boss just like normal. So with that guy out of the way, we've officially beaten World 5, and we did so without adding any more enemies to the counter. So now, we just have one more world to go, Donkey Kong Island. Let's do this thing. 6-1 is up, and immediately you can tell the difficulty is picking up. This level isn't that bad, but there were a lot more tricky jumps I had to pull off to get to the end. There was this one part where I had to avoid 2 penguins shooting at me, then I had to jump down and just barely avoid 2 more penguins and an owl. This part took me a few tries, but you can pull it off. 6-2 is next, and it is a very, very irritating level. There are so many damn enemies, and so many precise jumps you need to make in order to avoid them all. There's this one part where you have to walk on these rotating platforms while avoiding owls, and this one part where you have to lift this ship, but there's a stupid-ass bunny hopping along who you can't get rid of. Then immediately afterwards, you have to quickly run across these platforms, but there are these giant penguins and owls in your way, and oh, it's so annoying. I think I spent about, a half an hour trying to beat this stage. Hell, I even caved in and went to Funky Kong's item shop just to buy extra Dixie Kong barrels. Now, some of you might think this is cheating, but these items are official parts of the game, so I think it's perfectly fair for me to use them. But eventually, after lots of trial and error, I did manage to beat the level while avoiding all the enemies. Oh boy, that was rough. 6-3 takes place on these ruins that are constantly falling apart, and it won't take long for you to reach this part where you have to use this cannon to reach the next area and... oh, come on! Taking this cannon launches us directly onto this owl, meaning that's another enemy we'll have to add to the body count, right? Well, maybe not. Remember how I went to Funky Kong to get some Dixie Kong barrels? Well, there's also another item here that might be helpful, the green balloon, an item that automatically saves you from falling to your doom. But not all the time. Well, that's reassuring. So, I stocked up on a bunch of green balloons, headed back to that spot in 6-3, took a giant leap of faith, and... it actually worked! And once that's done, the rest of the level is pretty easy. 6-4 has you riding on another rocket barrel for most of the level, and this section has no enemies to worry about. You'll eventually reach this part where you take control of this giant snowball, and then... wait, hold up. Are those enemies? Oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no! Seriously, level, you were doing so well, but you just had to put these guys right here. So yeah, in case you can't tell, we can't exactly get around these enemies. One, because you're controlling this giant-ass snowball, and two, because you have such a tiny jump that you can't get over most of them. I was at least able to spare this one guy by jumping off the higher ledge, but aside from him, I had to touch a total of 5 enemies in this level alone, at the very end no less. But you know what? We're almost at the end, so let's just keep chugging along. 6-5 mostly has you avoiding giant snowflakes, but the enemies are pretty easy to avoid. Then of course you get to this part right here and... okay, so the game wants us to jump on these owls to get to the other side, which is something we don't want to do. I wasn't sure what to do at first, but then I remembered, oh yeah, I can just use the green balloon strategy from before. So I went ahead and gave that a try, and I accidentally hit a penguin on the other side. But that's okay, because I tried it again, and it worked. Thank you. Then the rest of the level you can get by with no problems. 6-6 has us climbing up a mountain during a huge avalanche. This level was tricky. Not only are the platforms constantly moving, but some of them fall apart if you stand on them for too long. This made avoiding a lot of the enemies difficult, and I had to make some crazy jumps in order to get by, but for the most part, you can get through it. But then you get to this part, where you're meant to jump on these 2 owls to get to a barrel cannon, but unlike before, I don't have a way around this. Jumping with Dixie Kong doesn't work because we don't have enough height, and you can't get a rolling start because you're too close to the owls. Now, some of you might be thinking, oh, why not use the green balloons and float up to the barrel? Yeah, I thought of that too, but here's the thing. Remember how on the description of the balloon it said it would only work some of the time? Yeah, well, the game decided this wasn't one of those times. The green balloon simply would not activate. I tried this part over and over and over again, but I couldn't get over these damn owls. So there was nothing else I could do, and I ended up having to touch one of the owls in order to reach the barrel. After that, there are these 3 penguins you're supposed to jump on, but you can get past them with a rolling jump. And then there's one more enemy we have to deal with too, and that's this rolling hamster ball guy. You can avoid him with a well-timed jump, and then you can finally reach the end of the stage. 6-6 ended up adding 1 more to the body count, but surely things can't get much worse from here. 6-7 has you exploring a factory that's frozen over, and you have to make sure not to get shocked by these electric balls. There are a few tight jumps in between enemies that might look scary, but they're not that hard to pull off. Also, fun fact, this level has another secret exit which leads you to some extra levels, but doing so just loops you back to 6-8, so it's not really worth it. Now it's time for 6-8, a stage that's filled with lava, and it brings back Rambi the Rhino, but unlike previous levels, we have to use Rambi to move forward as he's the only one who can destroy the walls blocking our path. So that means we have to try and avoid enemies while riding Rambi as well. The first half of the level isn't that hard. You just have to be patient for a few spots to not accidentally hit something. But then we get to this section. As you can see, there is no way we can get through this without touching multiple enemies. We have to use Rambi to break the blocks, but we can't wait for enemies to get out of the way because the platform is sinking into the lava. I was able to jump over one of the enemies, but I had to kill 3 more in order to get through. And if that wasn't bad enough, immediately afterwards, I had to jump on an owl to cross this giant gap. I tried this jump multiple times, but I just couldn't get high enough. But then came the final part of the level where I had to run super fast against the lava, and somehow I managed to dodge all the enemies here, and with that, I finally beat the stage. But not without adding 4 more enemies to the kill count. God, World 6 has been going just so poorly. But now, at long last, we've reached the final boss, and this adventure will finally come to an end. So we hop into the stage and come face to face with the boss, this big fat walrus guy. We enter the battle arena and the boss blows his big horn, sending a bunch of ice balls raining down from the sky. Some of them even spawn enemies onto the stage, and now we have to jump on the enemies and throw them at the boss. You know, I should probably be more upset about this, but World 6 has been such a pain in my ass for the home stretch that I'm just gonna accept my fate and move on. But yes, in order to win this fight, you need to pick up enemies and throw them at the boss. Otherwise, he'll just stand there and do nothing. He'll then jump onto the stage and try to ram you, so you have to take that opportunity to jump on him. That might not sound too bad, but the timing of landing a jump on this guy is much harder and more precise than you may think. And just like the other bosses, you have to hit him 3 times in order to move on to the next phase. But if you miss just one of the jumps, he'll retreat into the background again and launch more enemies at you, meaning you have to touch another enemy in order to get him back to the main stage. So, theoretically, the bare minimum number of enemies I would need to beat the boss is 3, but that means I have to perfectly jump on this guy 3 times for every phase. Trust me when I say this is easier said than done. As the fight goes on, the boss will run faster, meaning you have less time to react, and on top of that, you have to be careful not to accidentally jump on his horns, which is very easy to do. I tried and failed so many times to get the jumping down, and each time I was getting more and more frustrated. But I wasn't gonna give up that easily. I remembered I could use Cranky Kong so hitting the spikes wouldn't be an issue, and slowly but surely I got better with the timing and was consistently hitting the boss more and more. Then finally, after lots and lots of trial and error, I did it. I hit the boss perfectly each time. I punched that fat ass into the unknown, and with that, it's finally done. We beat the game, the island is returned to normal, and now I need to lie down. So, can you beat Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze without touching a single enemy? Sadly, no, it is not possible. We ended up needing to touch a minimum of 20 enemies to beat the game. Most of them came down to those last few levels. They were not playing nice. But even still, this was a very fun challenge to try, so I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if there are any other games you'd like me to try this again with, let me know in the comments below. But with all that said, thank you guys so much for watching. Leave a like on this video and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this in the future. Have a great day, stay safe out there, and I will see you in the next one.